and measured. And the Bible talks about it in another place, and they were found lacking. They were poor in the things of God. But this Messiah, this anointed one that Jesus is saying would come to them in the power of the Spirit, would proclaim good news that they could have, that they could walk also in the power of the Spirit, that their relationship to Jesus and to God could be restored. It was the Lord's favor. It was His goodwill to do that. It was His will to proclaim that good news to those who were captive. Now, not physically captive, but they were captive. They were chained to their sin. In a sense, Jesus is saying, I'm talking about you. Those who are in the synagogue are captive. And you need to see that for yourself. You need this word that I'm going to proclaim, that Jesus is going to proclaim to you, to see that you need this Messiah. And He came to those who were captive to their sins. Those who were oppressed in their sins. Those who were weighed down. You might be feeling that even tonight. That there's a weight of sin in your life. How could you ever stand before God? How could you ever stand before Jesus being captive? You can't get to them on your own strength, because those chains they're holding you captive and me captive without this Messiah. So it was this anointed one's desire to bring this good news that we could be set free, that those chains could be broken. That still applies for you and me tonight. And He didn't only bring that message to their ears. He brought it to their hearts. 3 things He would preach to them. That there was deliverance to those captives. If you could hear what He was saying you could be set free. You don't have to be a slave to sin. This gospel, it was a proclamation of liberty, of freedom. You don't have to stay there in sin, He was saying. You could be set free. And not only, what kind of freedom are we talking about? It was a freedom from what God considered the worst condition. Being set apart, or being put apart because of that sin, and not having any kind of communion with your Creator, with God the Father. He came to preach or proclaim this recovery of sight to the blind. Now, that's only good to those who understood that they were really blind, and Jesus is holding this word up to them and saying, listen, I know you're in church, but you're oppressed, and you're being held captive by sin, and really you're spiritually blind without this anointed one. And so He would come to preach that the people who were dwelling in that darkness have seen a great light, and for those dwelling in that region in the shadow of death, on them a light had dawned. Jesus came to His own, and we're going to see His own did not receive Him. But it wasn't for Jesus' sake. It's because they loved their sin. They wanted to stay in their darkness. And that doesn't have to be our case here tonight. That can change in an instant here tonight. Those things that are dead to God, and that's how deadly sin is. Because it says the wages of our sin is death. So spiritually speaking, God is here proclaiming good news to all of us here tonight. That we who are dead in our sin, this anointed one, this Messiah, this one who came to preach good news, and preach it to those who were brokenhearted and who could break those bonds of sin. He came here to preach that good news, to say that the dead can be raised to life here tonight. That it was the acceptable year of the Lord. This Christ came to sound the Jubilee. A very specific time. He came to let the world know that God whom they had offended was willing to be reconciled, be brought back in proper relationship with them. Those who were way over their head in debt, their sin was a debt load. and there was no way out of that debt. Tonight, God is here to proclaim that good news. That debt that you and I owe God, the same debt that we could never repay it. That good news says Jesus is here to cancel that debt, to make it as if it never existed. He preached healing to the brokenhearted, those whose conscience would not let them go. They knew they couldn't stand before God because of their past. They could just go easily down the 10 Commandments, whom they all would have known in their head, but maybe not so much in their heart. They knew, I've broken, well, if I'm honest, I've probably broken 9 out of 10 of them. And so my conscience doesn't even let me go to God. I'm so far away from Him that I could never think in my own strength of being able to walk towards God in my own power. But He came to preach that's not the case. That He was willing to forgive that sin. And He had the authority not only to preach this kind of a healing, but He had the authority and the power to break those chains. To take your hand and to bring you back to God. He continues on and it says, and He rolled up the scroll and He gave it back to the attendant and sat down. And all the eyes in the synagogue were fixed on Him. So with every mouth, you can imagine the picture, every mouth that has been silent, and every ear straining to hear the very next words, and every eye on Jesus to see what He's going to say to them. And He basically blows them away with what He says. It's an incredible thing. He stuns them. This Jesus with whom they were so familiar with. Remember, He was from Nazareth, and that's where He's preaching here. He was, in a sense, He was going to end this guessing game. Remember, He's basically saying, you know that anointed one? Remember, I'm talking about a guy who's wearing a white t-shirt, sandals, black hair, plays a guitar. And Jesus is saying, this anointed one was coming to set the captives free, to heal the brokenhearted, to preach the acceptable year of the Lord. He's basically saying now, I'm going to end this guessing game. And it leaves them with their mouths wide open, saying, I can't believe it. And they couldn't. Part of the problem was because they thought they knew this man. They thought they knew him. They were used to Jesus. He was from Nazareth, and they saw Him often. They would even ask later in the same chapter, isn't this Joseph's son? And now He's here, and He's plainly telling them, that anointed one that Isaiah preached about is in your midst. He came to His own. See, they thought one thing, and Jesus, remember, He was opening the scroll, He's opening the Word to them. And He's going to tell them something else, that Messiah is here. That He's finally come to set the captives free. And in one moment, as quickly as I snap my fingers, everything changes. He wasn't there just to shock them by what He said. He was there so there would be a change of heart. That those chains that He talked about that held Him captive would be broken. And the blind would now see clearly. They would receive spiritual sight. And their reaction is in verse 22, and they all spoke well of Him and marveled at His gracious words that were coming from His mouth. They spoke well of Him. Oh, that's nice, Jesus. We know who you are. Whatever. You're speaking those things. But really now, can you do those things that we heard you do in Capernaum? Can you do those things? You know what? We heard you feed 5,000. I'm kind of hungry. Can you do those kinds of things? That's sort of what they were more interested in. Rather, as opposed to their sin, their debts being forgiven. They couldn't do that on their own. And that's why He was there. And even though they said, we know who you are, or we think that we know who you are, but in fact, Jesus knew them. And they knew it was just, and Jesus knew it was really just lip service that they were giving Him. Agreeing with Him on one hand, with their mouth, but their hearts were far away from Him. And that's what Jesus looks at. And then he goes into